Welcome to the Citizens Band Radio Hour. Thoughtful conversations that explore issues of media and journalism, democracy and citizenship. The Citizens Band Radio Hour is sponsored by the Center for Media and Citizenship at the University of Virginia. You can visit the center online at mediaandcitizenship.org. Here's your host, Coy Barefoot.
Let's begin with Quentin Kidd. He is a professor of government and chair of the Department of Government at Christopher Newport University and joins us live on the program. Quentin, are you with me, sir?
I'm with you, Coy.
Hey, it's so good to hear your voice. It's been so long. It's been months since we've spoken, and I've really been looking forward to this all day, to catching up with you. Where should we begin, Quentin? There's just so much to talk about.
You know, we live in Virginia where politics is always happening. Elections are always happening. There's always an election season. But, man, you add everything going on in Washington and a General Assembly session, and I don't know where to start.
Let's just start with, how about we start with the latest numbers that the Wason Center down at Christopher Newport ran some numbers and put some polls in the field to find out where are Virginians right now with a host of some of the big issues facing the state and the General Assembly. What did you learn? What do you want to share with us?
So we got, the most fascinating part of this recent survey that we did that was focused on the General Assembly and focused on issues before the General Assembly. For 4 years, the Democrats under Governor Terry McAuliffe, wanted Medicaid expanded. Then Speaker of the House, Bill Howell, essentially said, no, it's not going to happen on my watch. We understanding that there was potentially a compromise on Medicaid expansion coming out of this session, we polled on it, and we find a majority of Virginia voters support the general idea of Medicaid expansion, but there's great division among Republicans and Democrats. Democrats really support it, Republicans really oppose it, and the net effect is a slight majority support it across the board. When we ask people about a compromise on Medicaid expansion that expands the program a little bit, but not quite as much as Democrats want, what we find is that majority goes up, and it includes Republicans, a slight majority of Republicans who support the idea of a compromised Medicaid expansion. And so the reason I think that's important is because while we're hearing about compromise enrichment a lot right now, what we see in our polling is that there is actually a political path to it within the electorate. Republicans and Democrats and Libertarians and everybody else in between, when you add them all together, there's a slight majority who would support a compromised Medicaid expansion, not quite the full one that Terry McAuliffe wanted, but something short of that.
So is that expansion money, federal money, still there, even with Trump in the White House?
Well, so the way it's interesting you would ask that. The way Medicaid expansion works is if the state decides that they want to expand Medicaid, what they have to do is apply to the federal government for a waiver of the normal rules in order to expand Medicaid, and then access that pot of money that is still available. It was made available by federal law that created the Affordable Health Care Act. So it is still available, but there's a real outstanding question as to whether the Trump administration would grant a waiver to expand the program. A lot of people who support a compromised Medicaid expansion say they think the Trump administration would grant a waiver because the exception that we would be asking for as a Commonwealth would include things like a work requirement or an education requirement or a service requirement, and those kind of requirements would be viewed upon favorably by a Trump administration, so people say.
Would the decision be in the executive branch, or would it be with the legislative branch who passed the law?
It would be in the legislative branch first and then the executive branch. I mean, it would be this would go through the normal process that a bill goes through to become a law, and then it would be up to the executive branch to essentially do the administrative things that are required to seek the waiver and get the funding.
So the expansion of Medicaid in Virginia would have to be a separate law. It's not that you just apply to some department that has already okayed the money. You have to get special legislation to get the money. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay.
You would have to have special legislation to authorize the governor to go seek the waiver to expand the program. That's the way it works, legislatively.
And Trump's doubtful to okay that, and the Republicans in Washington are doubtful to okay that.
If you look across the country at what's going on with this, what you're seeing is in a lot of states that are controlled by Republican, either legislatively or in the governor's office, a lot of states that are controlled by Republicans are looking at these exceptional circumstances where they would expand partially, not completely, and they would require things like work and stuff like that. That seems to be the way things are going in the Trump era, whereas in the Obama era, there were a few of those exceptions granted. Arkansas is one example, but mostly states were just seeking a full-blown expansion, and that seems to not be in the cards in the Trump years. But some sort of compromise expansion seems to be the alternative.
And what would it mean for Virginia? How many people are we talking about who would get health insurance now through that program who don't have it?
Well, they're saying between 300 and 400,000 people, and so a full expansion would cover closer to 400,000 people. It isn't clear how many would be covered in a partial expansion, but it's somewhere between 300 and 400,000 people.
Yeah.
Additionally,
right.
Those are people who don't have health insurance right now.
We're talking with Quentin Kidd of Christopher Newport University. Quentin, what did you learn about medical marijuana? Because that, of course, is historic news in Virginia, that's actually moving forward.
Yeah, well, you know what? For several years now, we've been polling on both medical marijuana and recreational marijuana, decriminalizing recreational marijuana. We have found, I think the first time I polled on this was 5 years ago, and we had strong majority support for medical marijuana, and we had majority support, but just above 50% for decriminalizing possession of small amounts of marijuana, so decriminalizing recreational marijuana. Those majorities have only grown over the years. We still find strong support for both. We're seeing movement in the medical marijuana side, but we are also seeing legislation introduced to decriminalize possession of small amounts of recreational marijuana. If I had to guess, sometime in the next several years, is it 10 years, is it 5 years, I'm not sure, but at some point in the next several years, we probably will see some decriminalization of the possession of small amounts of marijuana. I don't know what form that will take, obviously, how that will look, but I do suspect, just if you look at the way things are going around the country, if you look at public opinion in Virginia, we're probably going to move in that direction at some point in the next several years.
And chances are you'll only be able to get it at ABC stores. and the government.
I mean, the state will retain a monopoly over it.
Of course they will. That's that's holy cow. You want to talk about something that's so guaranteed? They smell money, and isn't that what's happening around the country? I mean, the states are smelling the tax money that they could get, and in Virginia, it's not tax money because they'll be the ones of the state government would be the ones to sell it, and to handle all of that. Marketing and distribution through their stores, just the same they do with liquor in Virginia. They'd be the ones that would make all the money off of it.
Sure, and it's going to be economic motivations that drive this. Washington D.C. and Maryland. Maryland is right behind Washington D.C. in this regard. I mean, it'll be economic reasons that drive it, but it'll also be political. Movements in public opinion and the political views about these things. What I find in Virginia is, as millennials became more and more a portion of the voting electorate, the voting population, public opinion on issues that used to be pretty firmly in one direction moved in another direction. We saw it on gay marriage. Don't forget, less than a decade ago, we passed a constitutional amendment banning gay marriage, and then within a few short years, we were finding majorities of Virginians who supported gay marriage, and then the Supreme Court overturned the restrictions on gay marriage. That was mostly driven by millennials. Views about marijuana, mostly driven by millennials. So I think this is coming in Virginia. I don't know exactly when. I don't know what shape it'll take, but I do think it's coming.
And we still have whiplash from that, from that sudden shift. You're right; it just happened so quick. Yeah. And if I hear you right, you're saying we're going to see the same thing happen with marijuana in America, even in places like Virginia or Mississippi or Alabama. I
think that's right. I mean, look, Tommy Norment, the Republican Senate Majority Leader from Williamsburg, is essentially the point person on the question of marijuana right now in the Republican Party. For many years, there was a Republican pharmacist from Gloucester who introduced legislation to decriminalize the medical use of marijuana. So, the holdouts are in the Republican Party, but it also happens to be Republicans in the House and the Senate who have opened the door to this idea. Democrats probably, for the most part, would support it, but there's been the holdout bloc in the Republican Party. As that holdout bloc gets smaller and smaller, the possibility of this legislation passing gets greater and greater.
Quentin, you mentioned millennials, and I want to sort of turn the page here and ask you about, you're on the front line of interacting with millennials every day and young people, teaching them the principles, not just of how government works, but why we have the government we have, and where it succeeds and where it fails and where they fit into the whole big complex mess of it, and democracy itself, its ideals, its purposes, its functions. There's a lot of recent studies in the past few years, Quentin, that say millennials aren't big fans of democracy. Can you shed any light on these studies and how you approach your students with that knowledge in mind, that this generation is very different from the ones that preceded it when it comes to appreciating democracy?
Yeah, Coy, remember, this generation, unlike our parents, for example, the greatest generation, or the baby boomers, this generation, millennials, never had to fight for democracy. They didn't have to fight any wars about this. And I find the vehicle by which any kind of softness on democracy travels for millennials is a suspicion of institutions. Institutions like big corporations, institutions like banks, institutions like the media, even institutions like branches of the federal government that handle financial aid, for example, and stuff like that. I think what millennials are often frustrated with, that causes them to say, to look like they're not as democratic as their parents or grandparents might be, is really reflected in a frustration at institutions that look like they've captured government. So government looks like it's captured right now by big business, by big corporations, by banks, by the media, for example, things like that. And I think what millennials do is they're reacting against the capturing of government. And they say, if that's democracy, then I see problems with that. And I think that gets turned into sometimes, oh, look, millennials are anti-democratic, or they're not supportive of democracy. I actually think it's millennials being critical of the capturing of government by other institutions. And then they see, for example, that elections, people who can or can't vote, they're fighting over that, voter registration, stuff like that. And so I think that's what's going on more than anything else.
They're just critical of the processes, and I guess, like Thomas Jefferson himself, critical of how money can influence government and capture its functions and its workings.
Yeah, I think it really comes down to money and the moneyed control of politics. Look, millennials came of age as the Supreme Court essentially said all restrictions are off in terms of money, campaign finance, Citizens United. Millennials came of age as Citizens United happened, and so the only kind of politics they've known, or many of them have known, maybe the oldest millennials remember a politics before Citizens United, but the only kind of electoral politics they know is one where big money controls a lot of the discourse. And so I think, again, I think a lot of times millennials are reacting against that. They're reacting critically to that sort of stuff. And so when you ask in a survey, for example, whether millennials support, various concepts related to democracy, if they relate those concepts to moneyed control of elections, big corporations' control of government agencies, well, then their reaction to that is reflective of the way they see things happening in society today. So I think our burden is to say, look, democracy works, and it works in ways even when it struggles against forces that might try to take it in a direction that a majority of voters clearly don't want it to go in.
It's fascinating, the dynamic that we see in that generation, because you see this sort of anti-democratic flavor on the far right and the radical left. I mean, the guys who were in the park in Charlottesville on August 12th, the alt-right, they hate democracy because they see it as sort of a failed a failed effort to organize power and to keep freedom, and they don't believe democracy is strong enough to preserve white privilege. And so they want to get rid of it and have like a Putin kind of character who can just run everything. And the radical left hates democracy because they don't like the idea that they just see it as sort of this holdover from the 18th century and this idea of slave owners, and that it's always been about white privilege. It's fascinating to see that they come to the same conclusion, but they reach it sort of different ways to get there, the far right and the far left.
Yeah, I try also to encourage students, and this is sort of the approach I take in my classes. I try to encourage them to take the long view as often as they can. I realize it's easy to get caught up in whatever the fight is today and whatever the argument is at this moment. But I try to encourage them to step back and try to see those arguments in a bigger context. And so I'll give you an example, right? So the arguments we're having right now about white privilege and about the Me Too moment, right? All of these arguments, seen in a larger historical context, are about a desire for equality of access and equality of opportunity and equality of place in a democratic society. And so if you see it in that context, then it helps you understand a little bit better what this is all about. The anti-immigration sentiment that is all the rage on the Republican side right now, it is about who's going to be let in and who's not going to be let into this larger democratic society. How open are we going to be to new ideas and new ways of doing things versus the way we've done things in the past and the way we want to, keep doing things. And so if you see these things in the larger context, what you realize is we're just having the latest round in a conversation that has been going on for a little over 200 years, 230 years or so. And if you see it in that context, then it doesn't seem as depressing or demoralizing. Instead, it seems in some ways encouraging that we're still having this conversation. We're still debating, how do we expand access? How do we expand opportunity? How do we expand political rights? Those are all of the conversations that we're having. That's what this is all about right now. And
that was the big debate in the election of 1800.
Exactly.
Do we really want democracy in America, or do we want to let the Federalists run everything? And it is fascinating, but tragically, it can get really violent, as we saw last summer in Charlottesville, and people can die because that conversation sometimes turns into a street brawl, and it always has. I mean, since the 1760s, the 1770s in America, the political differences in America, Americans have always taken those political differences to the streets, and sometimes they fought over them.
Yeah, our democracy was born of a blood feud, and we should never forget that. We have had a relatively stable, since the Civil War, political society, even as our society at large has become oftentimes more violent. We've often had a more stable political society, but it isn't always that way. We flare up into stages of violence. The 60s and 70s were very violent politically. The 2016 looks like it's opened up a pretty violent political era in our society. So we have had violent political periods in our society. They're often about access to power. Remember, politics is about the allocation of a limited set of powers. And so if you allocate access in politics, by definition, you're taking access away from other people, or at least part of their access. And so it's a serious business for people. And if you're on the losing end of that, like a white supremacist, then you might react in a violent way. And that has happened throughout the history of our country.
And fascinating to see the alt-right and the white supremacists in the park in Charlottesville using the very same language of an oppressed, marginalized group. I mean, yes, we had political stability in America following the Civil War, often at the cost of the suppression of human liberty. I mean, I'm thinking of Jim Crow. Yeah, that was stable, but at what cost? And that language of the oppressed and the marginalized, it is mind-blowing now to see white supremacists using the exact same language. That's why they were in the park in Charlottesville last summer saying, hey, look, you're trying to take out our statues for our white heroes, for our white history, and we want to celebrate them, and you're trying to erase us. That's why they're screaming, you will not replace us, you will not replace us. That's their chant, their cry, as in fashioning themselves now as an oppressed group.
That's exact. Yep. And if you try to understand them intellectually, the only intellectually honest way you can try to understand that group or any other group like it is to try to understand them in the context of their place in this political society. And they may not want democracy like other people do. They may not want the same kind of democracy. They may want something slightly different. They may want a slightly neo-fascist democracy. But you've got to, if you're going to try to understand them, you've got to try to understand it intellectually in that context. And the racist views people may recoil at that, but in order to really understand it, you got to try to be somewhat removed from the emotion and understand them in the context of this story that is the evolution of our democratic society since 1776.
And frankly, just to wrap up here, we have to do the same thing with the violent radical left. I mean, with Antifa. Sure. I mean, the mayor of Berkeley, California, and you can't get more liberal than that, he said publicly that Antifa, these radical left protesters, that they're a gang. They take over parks. They're very violent. They beat people up. If you don't agree with them, God forbid, look out. I mean, they will go after you and they will hurt you. And we have to approach them with the same kind of way, with a certain kind of patience to try to understand where they're coming from and put them in some kind of political context, but at the same time being aware that they have the potential to be incredibly violent.
Right. Violence is a left thing and a right thing. It isn't just a right thing. We've had periods of violence on the left as well, and quite honestly, violence isn't a movement thing. It's a human thing, and it's human beings that engage in violence, and so we can see violence, political violence, from people who aren't left or right. It is. But again, the larger point. It's a part of a larger story, a continuity and change in some ways about the evolution of our democracy over time. I often say to people, people will ask me, about our democracy in the age of Trump, and I say, well, I'm not that worried about it because I have confidence in our institutions. They have been pushed and pulled for 200 plus years. They've evolved. So if they're not up to the challenge, institutions will be dissolved. New institutions will be created. But I do think that the democracy that the founders put together is strong enough to withstand whatever we're putting at it right now.
Quentin Kidd is a professor of government at Christopher Newport University and the director of their Wason Center. Check him out online. Always great news coming out from the Wason Center and CNU and the research that they do. Quentin, let's talk again really soon, man. I've really enjoyed it.
Thanks for having me, Coy.
You've been listening to the Citizens Band Radio Hour, a production of the Center for Media and Citizenship at the University of Virginia. Archived podcasts are available online at mediaandcitizenship.org. The executive producers for the program are Siva Vaidyanathan and Coy Barefoot.